Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start we're going to start talking about chapter 16, section 5. Now, up to this point, this entire chapter 16, has been about the Civil War. And we talked in section number 1 about the strategy that was being employed by the North in order to win the Civil War. And we also talked about why the North had advantages with regards to people and technology over the South, while the South had advantages with regards to fighting a defensive war. It's a lot easier to fight a defensive war than an offensive war. And the fact that at the beginning they had better leaders because of the tradition, because of the lifestyle, they had better leaders. And at the beginning of the war, that really helped out and ultimately extended the war. When the war was originally started, they thought that it would be a very short situation, that there would be one scrimmage and then the war would be over and the South would come spurring back to the North because the North was the nation. The army belonged to the North. All of the stuff belonged to the North. Yet, in the first Battle of Bull Run, we realized that that wasn't going to happen. And it was going to be a lot longer endeavor than everybody thought. Well, the war took a very long time. Most of the war was fought in the South. However, from time to time, the South would try to take the war to the North. One of the things that ultimately was established was that the North finally, after a whole bunch of different leaders, whether it was McClellan or Burnside, they had lots of leaders that ultimately went by the wayside. But now, especially in the war for the West, we came across a leader, a military leader of the army that was proficient or good enough to be selected by Lincoln and be the guy that ultimately takes the North over the top. Who was that? Bruno. Who was the guy that in the war for the West began to show an ability to strategize and to fight effectively? Celine. Who is that? Yes. Nope, not Farragut. Remember, Farragut is really an admiral and he's dealing with the water, and you're right, from that perspective, he was in charge of the Navy. But I'm looking for the person who's in charge of the Army. Yes? Now McClellan, he was the first one. Remember, he trained and trained and trained and trained and was very slow and meticulous and didn't work out and was fired and ultimately ran against Lincoln ineffectively. Yes?
Grant?
Ulysses S. Grant.
Oh,
Very
yes,
good. In the war for the West, Ulysses S. Grant became the guy. He was the guy. Okay? Now, Grant utilized the resources that he had in the best possible way. And when I talk about resources, keep in mind that manpower is a resource. Now, oftentimes, in Grant's confrontations, the North lost more soldiers. But the North had more people to draw upon. So, where the North lost more soldiers, but it won the objective of the battle. And the objective of the battle oftentimes was to take over a city or to defeat a Southern army that had come north. So even though Grant would lose more men, he would meet his objective. And therefore, the South would have to go scurrying away. Okay. Now, in section number 5, we find that Grant is now becoming the guy. Okay, so we're going to see two people that emerge in the North to lead them. We've already talked about the leadership in the South. We talked about Robert E. Lee, and we're very familiar with Robert E. Lee. He was very good. We also talked about Stonewall Jackson standing there, you know, his unit like a stone wall, and the Virginians being the lead. But we really haven't gone deep into the North. And the North developed Grant and another gentleman And the other gentleman is just as important or as valuable to the Northern victory as Grant was. And his name was William Tecumseh Sherman. Those of you that know anything about World War II, in World War II we had a military tank that was called the Sherman tank. The Sherman tank was named after William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman, like Grant, was a military leader, and Sherman at the beginning of the war quit. Why? Because Sherman was upset at the politicians. At the beginning of the war, Sherman felt that the politicians, he had a brother who was a politician, and he felt that this was a non-necessary war, that the politicians could have found a way to keep the nation out of war, so he left. But ultimately, he found his way back into the war. And Sherman brings into being a couple of different things that are interesting to talk about. Number one, Sherman believed that when you're at war, everybody's at war. There's no innocence. Okay? Everybody's at war. What that means is that when he went through a city, there were no civilians. Everybody, if you were a southern city, you were involved in the warfare. So, Sherman came up with a plan. And Sherman's plan was to take his army, and keep in mind when I talk about Sherman's army, the North had several different armies. Remember the army of the Potomac, Grant had an army, and Sherman proposed to take his army with very little supplies. He proposed to take his army and live off the land. As he went through a city, they would take whatever it was that they needed. From the land, from the people. If it sounds like stealing, well, it's kind of a way of stealing because I conquer you, I take all your stuff. Okay? Now, Sherman proposed to kind of cut a swath through the South all the way to the water. And as Sherman's military arrived, oftentimes when they arrived, all heck was going to break loose. His military would take everything that was there. It was the type of thing that if you were in the Southern Army and you knew that Sherman was coming to your town and you were over here, you were thinking of deserting and going back home to defend your family because the soldiers just wreaked havoc on the population. On 2 occasions, the entire city were burnt down. In the South, and although we are in the South of the United States, but I think Miami is more a northern city that happens to be located in the South. But in the South, in Georgia, in Carolina, people, and mind you, the Civil War is a long way away. People still talk about Sherman. Okay? Why? Because he burned 2 major capitals, one in South Carolina and one in Georgia. He burned them down. Now, was he responsible for burning them down? When I say he burned them down, he wasn't lighting the fire. He wasn't putting the flammables around. But his army burned down the cities. Now, generally what he did is he would arrive to a town and he would say to his military, destroy anything that the South could use to fight. In other words, crops and ammunition, anything that had a military value for the South, he would destroy. So the South, after he left, couldn't come back and utilize any of those resources. As a matter of fact, there were a number of times where his troops destroyed railroad tracks. And in order to destroy a railroad track, you just can't take the track. What they would do is that they would grab the track and wrap it around trees. And those were called, I believe, Southern neckties. Because it looked like the trees had neckties because they would fold that and that track would never be able to be used again, because if you've ever seen at least model trains, you know that it has to be straight. If there is any wavering in the track, the train can derail. So by telling that to his men, on 2 occasions his men got carried away and set fire, and the entire city, remember that the buildings at that time primarily were made out of flammable materials like wood. So the entire cities burned down, and these were capitals of major southern states. So you can imagine that with this happening, as his army approached a new city or his army approached a new state, not only what he actually or what his military had actually done, but all of the word of mouth. Now it was much bigger. Now this monster and his monster machine was coming to town, and everybody was like super scared about what was happening. So Sherman and Grant really aided and helped the North ultimately win the war. And this led to the final defeat or the final surrender of Lee to Grant. Now, even though Grant's initials are U.S. Grant, and we know that that stands for what? I know, but what was the nickname that was based on his initials?
Unconditional surrender.
Unconditional surrender. Even though his initials were unconditional surrender, when Lee surrenders to Grant, he allows Lee's soldiers to go home with food and their horses. And he treats them, he has won, but he acts as a good winner. Ultimately, he treats them well and sends them home so they can go back. The war is now over. This is a period of time now of reconciliation, and Grant was about reconciliation. Okay, so he sends his soldiers back. He's honorable to Lee. Keep in mind that a lot of these people were classmates. A lot of these people attended school together. So there is a certain sense of honor that is given. So in Appomattox Courthouse, Lee finally surrenders to the North, and the beginning of getting back together again takes place. And one of the things that I'd like to talk about during this period of time, and I don't even know whether this children's tale originates during this period of time, but I think it's a very good story to talk about at this point when the North and the South had fallen apart and now they're trying to reunify. And the story is about Humpty Dumpty. And you know the story about Humpty Dumpty. Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. Not all the king's men or all the king's horses could put Humpty back together again. The United States had broken up. And now all the king's horses, meaning now the government had the task of trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And you'll see in the next chapter how difficult it is. Why? Well, keep in mind that originally when we started talking about this, what was the Southern economy driven on? What drove the Southern economy? Well, they were into farming, and their main crop was cotton. And in order to harvest cotton, you needed, you said it, slaves. And now there's no slaves. So not only did the South lose, but now after the war's over, now it can't go back to normal. Now its entire economy has to find a different way. It has to reinvent itself. And that's not easy to do. And keep in mind that even though we see an example of good sportsmanship, I would say, if you could use the word sportsmanship in war between Grant and Lee at the end, at the surrender in Appomattox Courthouse. Not everybody felt that way. You know, not everybody felt that way. There were people in the North that were extremely upset at what had happened and the fact that the South dared to leave the Union. And there were people in the South that weren't ready to let the war end. They didn't like the result. It's like yesterday's football game. You know, you don't like the fact that your team lost by 3 and you want to keep on playing. Well, guess what? The time has ended. You know, it's over. So it became very difficult for both sides with all of these emotions to kind of deal with what was happening. And that's the entree of what we're going to be talking about in the next chapter. But here, we're going to focus on major battles. And one of